just to emphasise that this is part of an ongoing process. Steve and I are coordinating an action research, action learning project, looking at all these different factors and how they link together. And this event was just picking up on two comments that we get all the time about training being a key part of the solution. And the other one, probably the most frequent comment we get from people when we ask how can we reduce the numbers of suicides and get them down from that 6,000 plus level nationally that they've been stuck at for so long. People say, let's do something in schools. We must be able to do something in schools. The part of the solution is doing something in schools, which then immediately raises the question, do what exactly in schools? And some of the issues are similar to the issues we've just discussed on panel one about making sure that it's safe and the right kind of training and support and so on, and not just training people to be able to signpost. They've got to have something to signpost to, etc., etc. But for the second panel, what we want to do is start off with Mike Palmer, who is now kind of nationally famous, isn't he, as one of the three dads walking. So you probably recognise Mike's face there. And whereas we had the example from panel one of Dean putting up this bill in Parliament, with three dads walking, not only have we had this amazing profile for suicide awareness and suicide prevention, the painful walks that you've been doing there, Mike, but also the campaign and the petition and the profile that gave, leading to a parliamentary debate. And I've read a lot of your comments and listened to a lot of your your interviews, Mike. And again, I'm sure you're again agreeing that this is just a small part of a much bigger picture. And what you're trying to do is to force something to happen, to have at least a base to build from. But I thought it would be a good place to start for our second panel, Mike. If you can tell us about some of that thinking behind what you're doing in schools, but particularly this mandatory component, having something in the school curriculum, and what else, what it looks like for you in terms of when people say, let's do something in schools, what do you envisage being done in schools which will help to prevent suicides in your view?
It seems it's totally logical. If you think about it, you've got to remember just over 3 years ago, I don't claim to be an expert now, but I knew nothing about suicide, young suicide or anything around it. We've walked with so many parents, so many bereaved parents over the years, and met some, wonderful people with the most heartbreaking stories. But what it all comes down back to all the time is, my child wasn't resilient. My child didn't know how to look after themselves and keep themselves safe. So, we talked to people who'd lost very young children, as young as 11, and it's absolutely shocking. But what the obvious thing is the kids didn't know how. They didn't have an awareness of how to look after themselves and indeed how to seek help. So the logical thing for us is we need to invest in our children. They are our future. I've heard some wonderful things talked about this morning on the first session about obviously intervention, mental health first aid. There'll always be a call for that. But if we go back, if we invest in our kids early doors about suicide awareness and suicide prevention in an age-appropriate way, a sensitive way, then we might avoid some of these issues later on in life. So I think what we're talking about here, I think we're talking about early years. As the Princess of Wales says, let's invest in our children so they understand their emotions. Let's build on this through primary school, into secondary school. At some point you must look at suicide prevention as a subject. The biggest killer of under 35s, and you all know the figures out there, around 200 school children a year are taking their own lives. Absolutely unacceptable. And we must talk about their greatest danger. So we're talking about investing in our kids. We need to get a balance between academic qualifications and life skills as well. We talk about mental well-being. We've talked about a few subjects here that could maybe, we talk about social media as well. but we need to get that balance. We have kids going to university now that we know who have a ruck of academic qualifications, but they don't have those life skills to keep themselves safe. You know, and we talk about investing in the future. We're talking about, you know, how can you know, these kids will become adults one day, they'll become doctors, they'll become MPs, they'll become all sorts of things, but how can they do their jobs properly if they aren't happy? We need to encourage a kinder, happier society, but we need to warn our kids early in school so they can develop into those parents as well that will have these life skills already.
And what kinds of things do you envisage happening in schools that will get us to this better place?
It has to be mandatory, as you said, whether it's taught by a specialised department in school or you bring charities in, I don't know. That's for other people to work out. But personally, I've seen it taught on a couple of occasions in 2 different secondary schools. The youngest year was year 7, and I know all those kids left those sessions. It was with charity called Every Life Matters and the Martin Gallier project, and they were absolutely wonderful sessions. They were so powerful, but each one of those kids left with a level of awareness they didn't have before, for themselves, for their friends, for anyone else they come in contact with, including their families. They knew they could reach out. They knew that help was there.
Right, that's great. Thanks, Mike. That's given us a good start. I'd like to introduce Helen Garlick now, who's well known to us. Helen's appeared on our radio show, and lots of people have read her book, No Time to Lie. And you're also an ambassador for the Zero Suicide Alliance as well, Helen. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
So, Helen, again, we get this response all the time. Do something in schools.
Yes.
Do something in schools or via schools. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think, you know, we were all coming at this from our own personal perspective, and perhaps if I just very briefly talk about mine, which is that my brother David took his life when he was 20 in 1981, but it was hidden in our family. My parents said it was a terrible accident because that was the way that they got through their lives. And when I was researching No Place to Lie, I actually came across the fact that one of his teachers had at one point said, "This boy has suicidal tendencies," which is a shocking thing to see in a school report. But, you know, within my family, it was kind of like very middle class family. My dad was a lawyer. My mum worked for him as a secretary. We did not talk about feelings. We didn't talk, you know, depression didn't exist. It was just get on with it. So the teacher spotted it more than my parents did. And I didn't spot it. I was actually just on, you know, trying to kind of get out of my environment, and I was in America when it happened. So it took me 40 years to write this book, No Place to Lie, but I think it's helped reach a lot of people. And part of that for me is about bringing out the conversation, because I think, you know, isolation is the key killer. When people feel really isolated, and that includes very much kids who feel like, you know, they've got these feelings, they don't know who to talk to. I think I just wanted to say a big yes to mandatory training. There are far more wiser people here than I am in terms of how that's going to happen, when it's going to happen. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Connor Warren as well, who's an extraordinary young man who will be and a young person, you know, he's Connor's 17, and to join in that conversation, I think is really big. Because I don't want this to be targeted, you know, it's like the children are at fault, let's deal with the children. This needs also to be raised up to the level of parents, the teachers, the school cleaner. Anybody who feels safe will be the person that somebody can go and talk to. And if we all start opening up those really difficult conversations, learning what to spot for, and then again, that's hard because of the people who are, the people who take their own lives, a third of them are very well known to medical professionals, and people are aware that that's a problem. A third of them might have been to their GP. A third of them are the happy-go-lucky types that, you know, it just comes completely out of the blue. So visually, the optics aren't always there for us. You know, we've got to get wiser about this. We've got to be asking questions. But the really big part of this for me is that everybody needs to be involved in that, because it feels to me that this generation at school, I mean, I've got 3 kids now who are 24 up to 32. And we also know, those of us who've been touched by suicide, that there's that horrible curse almost, which is that you are statistically slightly more likely for one of your children to die too. So, you know, one of the things I've been really keen on as a parent is to just be there for them, make sure that they can have the conversation with me. But one of my children still did go through a patch at university, and it was her GP in Leeds who was brilliant. So, you know, everybody needs to be involved in this conversation. We need to be talking to the doctors, and Zero Suicide Lines are actually doing quite a big piece of that with NHS England, which is important. I want to flag up a couple of things really, which I think are really important for everybody to know, is that one is that ZSA have this amazing interactive map. Okay, so that you can actually click on a particular area and find out what the particular factors are for that area. And I think that could be used for MPs in a wider scale. So, but it's a useful resource. Second thing is ZSA training, and I think Hema has already commented on that that training is free, and it's been taken by over 2.6 million people now for 20 minutes. It helps save lives. It helps open up the conversation, because what this generation of young people is facing is almost like a cascading down of trauma down the generations, because we know it's not only the trauma we have ourselves, but you know what we've inherited from our families and how that all affects us. So this is big picture stuff. Big healing needs to take place, and so you know, I just want to kind of almost like want to give everybody a hug who's involved in this conversation and say, let's link up as much as we can and work together, because it ain't going to be a 100-meter run. You know, this is a marathon, and we need to keep going. And Mike, I just want to say thank you so much for all the work you're doing and raising this to a public level, because it's huge. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Helen. And yeah, we'll sort of, you've raised a few issues there, which we'll come back to. And you've also introduced Connor, so you made my job a bit easier there. And I gather the two of you have actually physically met in the real world.
Right. Yeah.
So, Connor, you've set up an organisation with young people, for young people, to provide that kind of peer support. And so again, when we get this comment a lot about do something in schools, you know, it's easy to say that, but do what in schools? What does that mean in your terms that will actually help people with their mental health and potentially prevent suicides?
Yeah, first I'd like to completely echo what both Helen and Mike said. I've been having conversations. I'm a sixth form student myself, so I'm still very much involved in the education system, and I know how it works. And having conversations with a whole range of people within my school. I've had conversations just today with friends, with teachers about this topic. And I said to them, well, actually, you know, what do you think of this? Because mental health is something that's very much still taboo in a lot of schools. They think that kind of, you know, by mentioning these topics, we're then going to provoke ideas. I think I've heard a lot of schools say by talking about suicide within lessons, we're actually going to give people that didn't have those ideas, we're going to give them the ideas. And actually that's something that is completely false. And I think a lot of the time it is actually myth busting and saying, look, this is, you know, it's wrong. We've got these sort of ideologies of what we think based on pre-existing things that have been generational, and schools are kind of sticking with that. And again, schools don't have time. Coming out of lockdown, teachers are stretched at an all-time high with still trying to recover from the impact of COVID. I know GCSE students that are still trying to be taught the subjects, and schools don't have the time to be able to spend hours creating their own resources. And I think it's very much offering them to the schools and then working with the schools rather than just sort of piling it all on the teachers. Because I know typically what happens a lot of the time is schools talk about suicide and talk about mental health as a tick box subject. So they will brush over it in another way, whether that's through sort of assemblies. A lot of the time, there will be an assembly in front of 200 people where they mention, you know, they just briefly go over it. And that is not helpful for anyone, because what you want really in school is an in-depth and open conversation where people can talk about it, because young people want to be felt like they are valued and felt like they are heard rather than being told what to do. They want to work together and be seen as adults. And I think that's something that people really need to understand, is it's not, you know, all these old people making the decisions. They need to get young people involved. And I think that's something that schools need to take on board, that, you know, getting young people involved in these big topics is going to make sure that everybody kind of understands it and everybody's more engaged with it, and that will make a bigger and lasting impact.
Brilliant. Thanks, Connor. I'd like to introduce our final panel member for panel 2, and our final panel member for this event, Lisa Edwards. And Lisa, you do work you look at the sort of higher education end of the spectrum as well, and I gather you're doing some research, or about to do some research with universities specifically, but clearly here we're interested in schools, colleges, universities. We're interested in education system, and what its role is and what it can contribute to us helping to reduce the number of suicides. And again, you've got your own lived experience to draw from, so over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for including universities in this conversation. It's really, really important, because actually education is a spectrum, isn't it? From very, very early years right the way through to when people conclude their education. I think just to give people a little bit of background, because not everybody's au fait with universities, but we lose approximately 100 students a year to suicide. I mean, just let that statistics sink in a little bit. 100 students per year, that's 100 young people who've experienced really, really have had a very, very bad experience, and it's resulted in them taking their own life. And that's 100 families, close family, and also the university family as well, devastated by that death. And I think in terms of what we can do, in 2018, there's an organisation called Universities UK, which is like an umbrella organisation that represents the 140 or so universities that we have in the UK. They produced some guidance called Suicide Safer Universities. It was produced in conjunction with Papyrus, which everybody knows is a fantastic charity with which Mike's closely associated. And that was guidance for universities in preventing suicide. They followed that up in 2022 with other guidance in terms of supporting students on university placements, which is really, really important. They've also given guidance on sharing information with trusted others when somebody's experiencing a difficulty, a mental health crisis, or a difficulty that somebody at the university is concerned about. And also they've produced guidance on responding to a suicide as well. But unfortunately, across the sector, it's not clear who's actually taken up that guidance. It didn't come with a mandate. So in that respect, it's optional. So it's not clear across 140 institutions. The guidance is there, but who's actually used it? And students, the statistics tell us that students are not at any more, university students are not at any more risk than the general population. But actually, I think statistics can be misleading in some respects, because university students are a very, very distinct group. And there was some research done by the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Safety Mental Health, or NCISH, and they actually said it's on their website that, you know, students under the age of 25 would benefit from a greater focus on mental health. And we know that university places great stress on students in terms of academic requirements, and very often that comes with other things like the changing environment, loneliness that they might experience at university, being away from home for the first time, having to fend for themselves, having to live alone maybe, or live with people they don't know. And we know from research by NCISH that in the under 20s, things like academic pressures and bullying are indicated in suicides. But when you get to the 20 to 24 year age band, things like housing, workplace issues, including university, and finances are really, really important factors. So I think that it doesn't matter who you are in a university, whether you're an academic, whether you're the part of the cleaning staff, whether you're part of the library staff, whether you're part of the halls of residence, whether you're security staff, every single one of us has got a place we've got a place in suicide prevention, and suicide prevention should be along the continuum, right the way from early years in building that resilience and building those skills, like Mike has said, right the way up to continuing through all the education that somebody chooses to undertake, whether that be university or even an apprenticeship, and then right the way through into the workplace. Suicide prevention is a multi-sector, multi-agency approach, and there's no other way to do it. And everybody in society, no matter who you are, has got a place in that part to play.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So we've got, we can all point to examples. We've stated the problem there. We can all point to examples of some good things that have been done, individual schools or individual universities doing some great work, as well as others aren't doing great work or aren't doing very much, if anything at all. And we've got this issue of encouragement versus mandating certain things. We've heard about mandatory training in workplaces, and that could be mandatory professional training as well for teachers, for example. We're talking about Lee Fright and the Learn Network and their petition for a mandatory duty of care for universities to try and help tackle that problem at universities. And we're talking about some kind of form of mandatory coverage in the curriculum. Let's just start on that particular issue. Distinct from encouragement and evolution, what do we need to make happen as a minimum, if you like, in terms of mandating some of this activity?
Can I go there?
Yeah, go, Connor.
I think one of the things that is incredibly important is making sure that it's not outdated. I think a lot of the resources that are used in schools are very outdated. And when sort of creating compulsory subjects, it needs to actually, rather than just saying to schools, look, you've got to do this, and schools finding a 40-year-old resource that just ticks the box, we very much need to be working with the schools to then find out, okay, so we now know that it's mandatory for schools, but let's create something that will engage, because even in the past 2 years, so much has changed that resources made before COVID might not be applicable anymore for after COVID, because the whole world and being a teenager has completely changed. And I think that's something that's really important, because I know from my experiences of sitting in a PSHE lesson with a teacher who's just doing it because they need to tick the box, and an outdated resource that's typically a video from the 1990s of like, I think that's just not going to make an impact. People aren't going to remember it. So when looking at making stuff mandatory, it's not just putting all the pressure on the schools, it is having it as an open thing where everybody works together.
Yeah, and this is, again, Mike.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Connor. Yeah, I mean, when we've been speaking to the Department of Education, we realise what, I'll be quite honest with you, it's quite an antiquated organisation, really. They need to be far more proactive on this. And we've talked about the disparity between academic qualifications and life skills. That needs to change as well. But as Connor quite rightly says there, it needs to be kept up to date. There needs to be a standard. And this is, as you said, Paul, different schools, different organisation, education are doing their own thing, and some of them are very proactive, and praise to them, but some of them aren't. You know, we need to get a balance. We need to get it assessed. This is why it needs to be in the PSHE curriculum as a mandatory subject, that we can evaluate it as time goes by and absolutely keep it up to date. COVID, I don't think we've seen the total effects of COVID, to be quite honest. I mean, I lost Beth at the first week of lockdown. You know, she was one of the victims there, but I think young people who've gone through COVID are, you know, starting to display their own problems now. And, you know, I don't think we've seen the greater effects of that. And as Connor quite rightly says, you know, we need to keep it up to date, and it needs to be assessed and built on through the educational systems from early years, as we said, all the way through university.
And how does it actually work in terms of, Lisa, if I can come to you maybe on this one, how does it work in terms of the dynamics in the education sector, in terms of what gets included, what doesn't get included, what gets updated, what doesn't get updated? What is practically possible here, do you think?
So in terms of education, suicide prevention education, is that what you mean, Paul?
Well, I'm thinking about the education system more broadly.
Yeah.
So the argument is that if it's put into the curriculum, then it's in there and it will get taught. And Connor's raising an issue there about, will it be updated? You know, is it a tick box exercise, etc. But I'm just thinking about your knowledge of the dynamics of the education sector in terms of what is practically possible here.
So in terms of universities, students apply and attend a particular course. So in terms of what's taught depends on what course they're on. But we all do mandatory training, don't we? We all do things like lifting and handling. We all do things like fire training, you know. But actually, I'm more likely to die by suicide than I am by a box. Do you know what I mean? So I think that suicide prevention training or suicide prevention education should be part of a mandatory training program for all staff and all students, and that would be at a university level. So it would be each individual university who we would implement that. So but again, you know, guidance through the Universities UK does talk about suicide prevention and education, but like I said at the beginning in my introductory opening statements, that, you know, it's not clear about that uptake.
And Helen, if I can just ask you a question and then open it up to others as well. Thinking about the Zero Suicide Alliance training, we often get pushback from schools and elsewhere, but from schools saying, you know, you're trying to add an extra burden here. You know, we're already overworked and overwhelmed with things, and you know, you're talking about adding something else in terms of suicide prevention training and so on, and we don't have the support for that. And yet, on the other hand, you've got something like the ZSA training, you know, like a 20-minute online training that's evidence-based and experience informed and NHS endorsed. But you know, is that the kind of thing which you know, an organisation like ZSA would want to mandate, or it's trying to encourage? And what does it encourage people to do? Do the training and then what?
Okay, so I touched base with ZSA last week, and they said, you know, a big yes to mandatory training in schools, but they would kind of hand that over to other people in terms of how that might apply. I think they've always thought, you know, the best thing to do is kind of get on with it actually and put out the ZSA training that anybody can do, and it's on a voluntary basis. The thing is, we all influence people in ways that we don't know, and every time somebody does that training and say puts it up on, I don't know, LinkedIn or Twitter or something or other, then other people do it, and so that builds, that all helps. But I sort of want to kind of come back to this point about what we would need to do is identify the really good models and share that. So there's a school that my younger daughter is actually just about to start to train to be a geography teacher with, and it's called the Reach Academy in Feltham, and they have this concept of from cradle to career in terms of their kids. Yeah. So, and they're doing, you know, it's schools like that are really amazing, because when we talk about the problem with isolation and people feeling lonely, you know, the antidotes to that are communication, talking like we are, connection, and community. And those are the three things that we need to build on, so that there is this interlinking, which Connor's been talking about and Lisa's been talking about. So in terms of the schools, I think if we can share best practice, that would be great, and get those conversations out there. You know, I mean, what Mike's doing is terrific in targeting and focusing on, yeah, we need mandatory training, and then we need to talk about what works and get that conversation going. That so I think that's what I can share here.
Yeah, and there's a capacity issue here as well, isn't there? That you can have an organisation in Cumbria or an organisation in Devon doing great work. You know, to what extent is that possible to mandate something across the country? So again, it comes back to what the minimum is we're talking about, what else we can do, and again, addressing some of these concerns that people raise about teachers' workloads and will it, you know, will parents be involved, and at what age do you get kids talking about suicide prevention? You know, when you hear some of these concerns coming back at you, how do you respond to them? Go on, Mike.
I think it's priorities, isn't it? As I was saying before, we need to get a balance between academic qualifications and life skills. And you know, you need to prioritize your investments into schools. You know, and I've said before, I haven't really got the answer, but who teaches these skills around suicide prevention? You know, maybe you should have you have geography teachers, you have maths teachers, you have English teachers. Maybe you should have teachers of mental health, good mental health, and all subjects around that. You know, a lot of the charities out there, including Papyrus, have wonderful resources. They could come in, but at the end of the day, if you want to keep a standard, if you want to do that, if you want to be able to monitor a standard across the board, it has to be done by the schools themselves. And some of the schools I've been into as well, you know, that they are employing mental health specialist staff within the schools now, because they are recognizing the problem. As I say, we can't have our young people leaving the education system, say, with a lot of academic qualifications, but not those life skills to keep themselves happy and resilient, to be able to live a life into adulthood, parenthood, and everything else. We need to prioritize that and get back to basics. So where the investment comes from, what we need to prioritize. So, yeah. And
Connor, I can see people already trying to grab you to come into their school, inevitably. But
yeah.
Clearly, capacity is an issue. We haven't got 200 of you around the country. So, what do you think is practically possible in schools within existing investment, and what do you think needs greater investment to make it happen?
I think students very much, when we talk about subjects such as suicide, such as mental health, they want it to be delivered by somebody that they might not necessarily see every day, because then you've almost got that, if you were to get an external person in from a mental health charity, local charity, and come in, you've almost got that thing where you can still talk to them, and you don't have that burden of, I know a lot of young people, they feel like if they were to have to see their teacher every single day, they don't want to open up because they don't feel comfortable in doing that. And I think it's very much about, I know lots of schools, I think it's going to become compulsory soon, where every school has a mental health lead. And I think, again, that's something at the minute that every school is supposed to have a mental health lead. The realities of that, and actually, if you look at the priorities of that job role, I know that some schools may take advantage of that and use that as kind of somebody that can just do loads of admin and stuff like that. And I think it's very much trying to get people involved. And as Helen said, it's all community focused. We are a community. We need to work within the community. We need to bring in external people. We need to do all these things and use the pre-existing things that are around. Because there's some incredible organisations across the UK that, you know, you might not even know of a mental health charity 2 minutes away from you, because there isn't that open, there is no database with every mental health organisation in the UK. There's none with counties. And it's very much kind of finding people in your community that are able to come into schools and discuss it. because as I saw somebody said in the comments about lived experience, you're going to get a lot more engaging presentation from somebody with lived experience than you are from a teacher who's getting paid to teach.
Sure. Okay. And Lisa, we had a brief conversation about this the other day about when you kindly agreed to be interviewed as part of our action research project, but about the difference between the core mandated stuff that should be in schools and targeted support for individual students that need support. And can you just elaborate a little bit more on that for us, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're seeing an increase in demand for mental health support across the university sector. And like I said at the beginning, it's really, really important that everybody in the university has a role in identifying those students. So whether it be you notice a student who's maybe changed their appearance or not engaging in class, or is coming to you in a distressed state as an academic, as a personal tutor perhaps, I think it's really, really important that we all have our role, and we all identify students. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Could you just repeat the question?
It was this issue around what is made available for everybody, like mandated training versus targeted support that is available for individual students that are struggling.
Yes, that's where I was going with that. So yes, I think it's really, really important that individual students who have needs and have that need for mental health support are given it. But I think it's important to say that university services, so the student services, the counselling and mental health services that exist in each university, are not a replacement for statutory services. So I think it's important that we work with NHS partners. Universities are important to work with NHS partners so that there's a continuity of care, there's a person-centred care for each student that needs it. So I think there's that in terms of the individual students themselves who are needing help and support, whatever that help and support may be. But also there's the need for the training that we've been talking about in terms of building skills, building resilience, building the oh gosh, I'm struggling with my words today. Building those skills in each individual person to be able to cope with what universities throw at you, because actually when you come to university, it's hard. You're not just coping with an academic course that you're on, you're coping with lots of other things as well. Maybe you've got some personal circumstances, maybe you're dealing with a recent bereavement, or maybe you're dealing with childcare issues, or maybe something's happened when you've arrived at university. It's not just the academic course we're dealing with people's lives, and very often the older we get, the more complex our lives become. So they're less complex usually when you're younger, but not always, of course, because we have young people who experience some terrible things in their lives, but generally they're more complex. So individually we need students to have access to support when they need it, and the right support as well. But as well as that, we need the training across organisations, and including, really, really importantly, the right people. Because, for example, somebody in crisis or somebody in extreme distress might not be the first person that they come to as an academic. It might actually happen at 2 o'clock in the morning. So it could be the security staff that deal with it, or it could be somebody in the halls of residence. So it's really, really important that everybody in that environment, that small community, if you like, that micro community of a university, is trained to deal with suicide prevention. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Lisa. And obviously at that age, I don't think many people would disagree with it being appropriate to have open conversations around suicide awareness, suicide prevention with university age students. Maybe some people would disagree, but most people would agree with that. When it gets into schools, it gets trickier. We often get pushback in terms of, is that appropriate at certain ages? and at what age should you be openly discussing suicide. Helen and the other members of the panel, what are your views on this about at what age it is appropriate or not appropriate to be having open conversations about suicide awareness and prevention?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things as a society, we're actually very averse to talking about death and grief as a whole. You know, I mean, I remember when my 7-year-old's daughter, grandma died, I took her to the funeral because I think it's important that we do have conversations about death and, you know, what happens. But in a Western society, what do we call Western? It's a weird society that we're in. We're sort of Western educated, industrialized, rich and developed, but actually we're really poor on community and the connections that are really important to make life worth living, actually. So I think personally, I do talk about death because it's a natural part of life. My kids have been brought up in the countryside. They've seen, you know, animals mating. They've seen animals dying. We've had that conversation about death, and as humans, we're probably the only species who actually takes their own life. So I would still talk, personally, I'd still talk about it, but I mean, Lisa, you may know more about the research, about what's appropriate. I think there's certainly, people are very scared about talking about it. There's a terror of mentioning the word suicide in case just by mentioning the word, we all know this, don't we? That just by mentioning the word, you're more likely to make it happen for somebody else. Whereas the reality is that other person is already thinking about it. And if you say the word, then it opens up a conversation. Yeah. So I mean, but I think this whole issue about who does it is a really interesting one. It needs to be a safe person. And, there are lots of teachers in school who really aren't safe for students. And also, it's an extra pressure on them. So I think we'll need to look at that. I haven't got any magic answers, but I would be with Mike in terms of thinking about talking about life skills, talking about resilience, talking about emotional health as being really important. There's been so much of a stress on academic qualifications as opposed to being a human being and what that means and being able to face all the stresses that we've got at the moment. So as early as possible would be my view.
I think, Paul, sorry to jump in.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
It's building bricks, isn't it? I'm talking from early years. You don't talk about suicide prevention then, really, but you're talking about emotions. You're talking about help-seeking behaviour. You're building up to all these things. And where you actually introduce suicide prevention, we know that kids in year 6 and whatever are struggling. I can't give you an exact age. I have my own opinions. But it'd be around that time, and then you build on it. You keep building, say, all the way up through the education system. It's you build on it.
It makes sense, Mike. But I was interested in looking at some of the comments you got on some of your social media with your campaign, where it was overtly suicide prevention in schools, and some people pushed back on that, saying that we shouldn't be discussing it at a certain age. It's not about suicide prevention, it's about awareness raising. Now obviously you're fully aware of all that anyway, it's just that you've chosen to go down that particular route with the petition. But I had an interesting conversation with a kind of professional working in this field recently, who said, as a professional, I'd like to be discussing suicide in primary schools, but as a parent with a couple of kids, I feel nervous about them talking about suicide at school with my children. So it's a tricky one, isn't it?
If you don't talk about suicide in schools, suicide prevention in schools, sadly, the way society is at the moment, young people will have their mobile device, they'll have their mobile phone, they'll search what they want to, and it will take them to the darkest places. So if we don't teach them in schools where it's safe and controlled, they'll do it themselves, and that's unacceptable.
Yeah, it's a key point. I'm conscious Lisa's been very polite and put a hand up there, so you're in next, and then I'll come to Connor. You're on mute, Lisa.
Sorry about that. I was just going to say, when Mike said about teaching suicide prevention in primary school at, year 6, I was speaking to somebody who works on a helpline, a crisis helpline, and the youngest that they've had contact that was 5 years old. So we've got children who have an awareness of feelings that they don't like and they don't particularly want. We have an awareness of that. So if somebody's got an awareness at 5 years old of being able to contact a crisis line for help, then I think that suicide prevention should be right the way from early years. And it doesn't mean that we have to be telling 2 and 3 year olds and 4-year-olds the word suicide initially. We might be talking about feelings and expressing our feelings, which as I understand in the very, very early years curriculum now. So that is suicide prevention, teaching people how to express feelings.
And that's kind of just a Q in, Connor. I mean, that's quite common, and we're hearing, people kids 10, 11, 12 talking about suicidal thoughts and feelings. We've got data showing 7% of 17-year-olds have made a suicide attempt at that point. So, Connor, what's your view on this issue of openly discussing suicide and suicide prevention in secondary schools or even primary schools?
I completely agree with all the other panelists. I think mental health should be taught and suicide should be taught as young as primary school. It's very much a conversation that, especially with social media, I know that another thing I do is, one of my jobs is I help run a kids club during the holidays at one of our local holiday parks. I had children as young as 5 and 6 with their own mobile phones, which they had their own mobile phone on them constantly. And they've got access to social media on that. They've got access to platforms like TikTok, which can both be used for good and bad. You can see both sides of TikTok. You've got this whole world open up to you where you learn about things. And if schools aren't then sort of talking about it, they're only going to learn stuff through social media. And I know from my past experiences that I've maybe only had several mental health lessons in my span at secondary school. I can probably count them on one hand how many lessons I've had on mental health. And I know that subjects such as self-harm as well has also, they very much have the only conversations we've ever had as a school has been brushed over in a safeguarding conversation. So I know lots of schools are like that. Schools are getting better. I know my school has progressed a long way since. However, from conversations I've had with other students, schools are still only talking about issues during their term timely safeguarding assembly that, tick box 200 students sat in a room. And I think social media, and as lots of people said, the media in general. I think I watched, I'm not sure if anybody else watched this, but the Caroline Flack documentary that came out a few years ago. And that was a story that obviously was all over the news. Lots of young people, the fact that she was the presenter of Love Island, and almost created this whirlwind of actually young people, shows such as Love Island. You learn, there's got such a teen culture of people watching them. And then when you do get the topics such as suicide come into it, young people just don't know, if you're not being taught in school, you've got a very you've only got half the story. You've only got the conversations you've seen in the media, and you don't actually have the academic educational side, because we can all go on for hours about the media and how, everything's spun in a certain way. And if schools need to make sure that students will find out about these topics one way or another. It is everyday life. These topics come up in everyday conversations, and schools need to understand and accept that and actually do something about it before it becomes too late.
Yeah, and Mike, you got your hand up. We'll just get a comment from you, and then we're going to wrap up shortly. But you had your hand up, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Connor is a great example of young people wanting to be taught, wanting to be made aware, wanting to understand about their own mental health issues, including suicidal thoughts and all the rest of it. They want it. I think society, Department of Education, I think parents as well, I think we shy away from it, but these young people want to know how to keep themselves safe. And inevitably, they just want to have a happy life, don't they? They want to know how to cope, you know, and we need to do it in schools. And I think Connor's a great example of championing this.
And just any final remarks from you, particularly on this issue? Again, I'm just reading, glancing, not struggle to look at all those comments in the chat, but I'll have a look at them later. But you know, some concerns again about the pressure on teachers and so on. Obviously, it's working towards a situation. We're trying to all work towards a situation and involving teachers in developing this, that we can all get to a better place. We've heard about the benefits to students. Presumably, in this world we're trying to work towards, there's benefits to teachers and to the schools themselves by having this integrated into the work they do.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be an all-round awareness, doesn't it? I understand the concerns about pressures to teachers, you know, but if the teachers themselves had maybe had some of this training when they were at school, they'd have skills now. But obviously we have to address the pressures there, and who teaches it, we don't know. But obviously there'd have to be an organisation where those teachers are competent in doing it, happy doing it, and they are looked after themselves. I don't see it as a situation where teachers have suddenly have extra responsibility to teach suicide prevention. That's not healthy and that's not right. So the organisation has to be looked at, and who teaches it, I don't know. But there are people out there, whether it be charities, organisations, or the schools themselves, there are people who are competent and will be brilliant at teaching these subjects.
And your petition has been a catalyst to get people thinking about that, to try and push something forward, which will then go into a process of developing the right thing in schools, yeah?
Yeah, what we just see is an absolutely logical process. You know, this is the greatest danger to our young people, yet we are not really addressing it as a society. You know, we need to educate our young people so they can have long, happy lives.
Yeah, sure. Helen and Lisa, any final comments from you before we finish?
Lisa, do you want to take the floor?
Thanks, Helen. I just think just to agree with Mike in everything he's just said there, that yeah, it needs to be taught. It needs to be taught by the right people, who is up to probably other people to decide. But I think that the funding needs to be there to do it properly and effectively. Yeah, and I think that we need to think about education and suicide prevention across the lifespan, right the way through the education sectors, right the way through from early years, right the way through universities, apprenticeships, whatever it may be, in that higher education that somebody undertakes.
Yeah.
Final comments, Helen, and I'll come to Connor.
Just briefly, I mean, I think there's some really fantastic comments coming up, and one of them is talking about, you know, about the teachers' mental health themselves and the shortage of staff and that sort of thing. And that may be something that Zero Suicide Alliance could actually get involved in, because they've done some big work with veterans and students more recently, and prisoners and probation officers. So that may be some. So I think, you know, we need to keep our, whilst being really targeted as Mike's doing, we also need to keep open to how we help how we help the carers care for people, and look at everybody's mental health. But thank you so much for everybody for your fantastic comments and for actually being part of this.
Thank you. Well, I've noticed in the chat, Connor, someone's put Connor for PM. I wouldn't wish that on you, Connor, but final word from you, Connor.
I think I just, you know, it's something that young people want to be seen and want to be heard. And I know a lot of people still shy away from that and still think, you know, it's not putting additional responsibility. It is actually helping young people, because I think if COVID's taught us anything, it's that to become more independent as such, and getting teenagers involved in big topics and topics like this is really important, and it'll help us go a long way.
Brilliant, thanks. Steve, we've run out of time, as always. So
I know. Thank you, Paul. I'm aware people are starting to drop off now, the numbers going down. So I'll keep this very brief. Firstly, thank you to all of you, Connor and and Mike and Lisa and Helen for this afternoon, and to everybody, all our panel members today. We could go on for hours, we know, with these conversations. It's a lot to squeeze in, but thank you all. Paul, thank you as always for your hosting, keeping everyone on track.